Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. When we think about ancient Buddhism, we usually picture serene monks and nuns meditating peacefully under lush green trees, just completely detached from the material world. But if we actually open up the ancient texts, specifically the Sarvastivada Vinaya, which outlines the rules for the monastic community, we find something wildly different. We find intense human drama, property disputes, public relations disasters, and, honestly, a whole lot of very specific boundary testing. Today, we're going to contrast the magnificent spiritual ideals of Buddhism with the earthy, practical reality of what it took to manage a community of early nuns who were known as bhikkhunis.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for the day. We'll be looking at Section 1, the historical background, Section 2, the strict ordination process, Section 3, daily life guidelines, Section 4, monastic versus lay boundaries, and finally, Section 5, the significance for spiritual practice.
To start us off, check out this quote. Throughout the text, whenever a nun acts out and the community complains, the Buddha responds with this exact frustrated reprimand. How can one be called a bhikkhuni and do this? It's such a great hook because it perfectly highlights that early monasticism wasn't some pristine utopia. It was full of very human behavioral issues that required immediate, practical management just to protect the community's reputation.
Now, to manage these behaviors, the text heavily references offenses called pachitya. Think of these as severe human resources violations. If a bhikkhuni committed a pachitya offense, she required formal expiation, basically a confession. The text literally states that these offenses act as a burning, boiling obstruction, and if they aren't repented, they will actively block the practitioner's spiritual path. These rules weren't just arbitrary. They were instituted specifically to resolve conflicts, maintain harmony, and protect the broader monastic community's reputation.
All right, moving to Section 1, the historical background, managing early monasticism.
Now, what's really interesting about this is you have to realize that early monasticism in ancient India was kind of like a spiritual Wild West. The community faced real-world drama that forced these guidelines into existence. We see these recurring troublemakers constantly testing the boundaries. For instance, there's a nun named Kundananda who literally operated like a toll booth. She demanded robes, bowls, and medicine as bribes before she would even ordain someone. No way, right? We also see nuns ordaining married women who were actively running away from their husbands, which caused massive outrage from the laymen. And then there's Thulananda, who ordained new disciples every single year, not for spiritual reasons, but simply because having more disciples meant she could hoard more donated food.
Let's look at Section 2, the strict ordination process, which was basically a rigorous interview.
Because the timeline for ordination was intense. You couldn't just show up and get a robe. First, a candidate had to undergo 2 full years of probation, strictly following 6 fundamental rules. Then came a highly formal public interrogation, right in front of the community. They were asked point-blank questions. Do you have debts? Are you a runaway slave? Do you have contagious diseases? Do your parents and husband actually consent? Only after passing this intense vetting process would there be a formal vote by both the bhikkhuni and bhikkhu sanghas to officially accept the candidate.
Breaking down these commitments really highlights the extreme contrast between the soaring spiritual commitments of ordination and the basic human frailty we're talking about today. Upon ordination, nuns had to commit to the 3 dependences. They agreed that at baseline they would survive only on discarded rags, begged food, and, get this, fermented cow urine as medicine. Plus, they had to strictly observe the 8 defeats. If you broke one of these, it meant immediate permanent expulsion. It was described like a palm tree cut off at the top, it's not growing back. These included absolute prohibitions on sex, theft, murder, and lying about your spiritual attainments.
Which brings us to Section 3, daily life, robes, chores, and chaos.
Setting high ideals is one thing, but enforcing daily behavior is a completely different story. Imagine you're an ancient Indian layperson, and you just wander down to the local river. So, I'll pose this question to you. How do you think the public reacted when they saw nuns bathing naked in the local river? Because this was a real PR disaster documented in the text.
Well, the public, specifically lay women, severely mocked them. They shouted that the nuns looked terrible, unrefined, and honestly no better than common servants. They were asking why the nuns didn't just give up their vows altogether. When the Buddha heard about this public ridicule, he didn't just scold the nuns. He mandated the creation of specific bathing cloths and even detailed the exact measurements they had to be. It shows that rules like this were entirely reactive solutions to real public backlash.
and the Buddha had to practically micromanage every corner of their daily chores. Nuns were given incredibly strict timelines. If you start making a robe, you have to finish it within 5 days. You must inspect your 5 robes every 5 days so you don't lose them. You are absolutely forbidden from giving your robes away to lay people. And fascinatingly, they were banned from spinning yarn or working looms at the monastery. Why? Because lay people would visit and see the monastery looking less like a serene spiritual retreat and more like a bustling textile factory, which severely damaged the community's aesthetic image.
Moving right along to Section 4, Boundaries, the monastic versus the lay world.
And this brilliantly illustrates the starkly different expectations placed on monastics versus lay people. These boundaries were essentially public relations guidelines designed to visually and behaviorally separate the ascetic lifestyle from worldly indulgences. Lay women of means were expected to ride in carriages, carry parasols to block the sun, and wear these noisy, decorative coin belts. Nuns, on the other hand, were expected to walk, practice visible asceticism, and remain entirely independent from worldly vanities and servitude.
But, as we've seen, the nuns constantly blurred these lines. We have records of Kundananda sweeping floors and cooking in lay people's homes like a hired servant, which totally degraded the Sangha's dignity. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the arrogant Thulananda marching into a nobleman's home and demanding to sit on his personal, high-status bed. Other nuns were caught wearing noisy coin belts in the market or joyriding in carriages with lay women during festivals. Acting either like wealthy nobility or submissive servants both completely destroyed the image of a detached, spiritual seeker.
And boundary testing had severe practical consequences, too. Let me ask you, what do you think happened when Thulananda, our notorious troublemaker, decided to just wander out of the monastery into the village without entrusting her room or her belongings to another nun?
Yep, disaster struck. A fire broke out in the monastery. Because Thulananda hadn't entrusted her space to anyone, and because she was so widely disliked, none of the other nuns wanted to risk saving her stuff. Everything burned to the ground. This massive loss of communal property drove the creation of a very basic, strict rule. You cannot leave the monastery without explicitly transferring responsibility for your living space.
So that brings us to Section 5, the normative significance for spiritual practice.
So the crucial point is, it's really easy to view these rules as endless bureaucratic red tape, but they existed to fiercely protect the nun's spiritual focus. For example, there were strict pasitya offenses for reading, reciting, or teaching worldly magic spells to lay people. Why? Because a bhikkhu's job is to study the Dharma, the sutras, and the Vinaya, not to act as a village shaman to earn favors. Furthermore, there were strict rules demanding attendance at community meetings, robe distributions, and the fortnightly recitation of the rules. You couldn't just opt out. This enforced discipline kept the community unified and focused entirely on their spiritual goals.
During the ordination ceremony, the presiding teacher offers the new nun this incredibly beautiful piece of encouragement, saying, "Like blue, red, and white lotuses growing daily in the water, your good roots will also grow daily." It's such a great metaphor. The strict rules are the water. They are the necessary environment that allows the beautiful lotus of spiritual liberation to actually bloom.
Ultimately, the core takeaway is this. By enforcing these highly specific rules regarding robes, chores, public behavior, and community obligations, the Buddha was actually ensuring the survival of the Bhikkhuni Sangha. In the deeply patriarchal society of ancient India, these strict boundaries created a safe, sustainable, and socially respected container for women to step outside traditional household roles and pursue ultimate spiritual liberation.
Which leaves us with a fascinating paradox to ponder. When we look at these hundreds of meticulous, sometimes seemingly mundane regulations, were these ancient rules merely arbitrary restrictions holding these women back? Or, by managing the chaos of human nature and securing the respect of society, were these strict disciplines actually the ultimate necessary foundation for achieving true spiritual freedom? Think about that as you reflect on the incredible history of the early bhikkhunis. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.